Hello and welcome to another episode of the Other Ranting Atheist. Yes, I'm not the only one out there, and I'm really happy about that. So what will I be ranting about today? Well, usually I like to rant when something's fresh in my mind, because I usually go over things in my head, and while it's fresh, I like to do a rant right away. However, I usually can't do that because I don't have my microphone handy. But I was thinking a couple days ago about something I've talked about already, which is street preachers and their concept of morality, or specifically morality in the United States being less than it was at a previous moment in time. And that's what I want to rant about. So, thinking about it, as I was doing my walk, and how street preachers are always talking about how in the United States, the United States is depraved, and there is increase in immorality due to um, homosexuality and transsexuality, and talk about marijuana legalization and things like that. And it makes me think how it's just the street preachers are just like anybody else that is religious. It's just dogma. They don't really think about what they're talking about. They're just going based on their interpretation of the Bible. And their interpretation of the Bible is dependent on ideas that they already have in their head about who God is and what God does. So their view of Christianity is what determines how they interpret the Bible, and then that is what they speak on. And so they're always talking about how the United States is so depraved and God hates America because, there's so many homosexuals and transsexuals, and everybody's drinking and smoking weed, and so America's going to be destroyed. We need to go back to a time where America was more moral. But logically speaking, that doesn't make any sense. Because if you ask any street preacher, is slavery moral? And is genocide moral? They will overwhelmingly say no. So then my thing is, if slavery is not moral and if genocide is not moral, then how can you say that America was more moral in the past where everybody was Christian? They'll say, well, the immorality now is due to people leaving Christianity. So more Christians equals more morality. But if that's the case, then you have a problem, because when you go back to the inception of America, genocide was legal and accepted, and so was slavery. People didn't have a problem with it. And so that's why not everybody, those who could afford it, had slaves. And there was no issue with it. And genocide, the Native Americans, the settlers who came over to the Americas had no problem getting rid of the Native Americans and taking their land. So slavery and genocide are basically part and parcel with America. America would not exist without those two things. And as I said before, if you ask any street preacher, they'll say that genocide and slavery is immoral, but it's those two things are foundational to America. And if you go back to the inception of America, it's everywhere. Genocide is everywhere, and so is slavery. So you can't tell me that America is depraved now because we don't have enough Christians, and we need to go back to the time where everybody was Christian, when at that time where everybody was Christian, you had slavery and genocide, which Christians, specifically street preachers, will admit is immoral. It doesn't make sense. How can you say that immorality is due to the lack of Christians or decrease in Christianity when slavery and genocide was everywhere at a time where everybody in the country was Christian? That doesn't make any sense. And this is the dogmatic portion of Christianity, because Christianity says that Christians or God is the source of all morality. And so street preachers take it a step further and say that if you're not a Christian, and in many cases to cover their butts, what they'll say is that if you're not a true Christian, then you'll lack these moral principles that you're supposed to have, and which can only come from God. But then that doesn't make any sense because Christianity is only what, maybe 3,000 years old? So if you're saying that there's no morality without Christianity, then that means that there was no morality before Christianity, but we know that's not the case. We know that a lot of the laws of the Old Testament come from previous laws from different civilizations and cultures, such as the laws of Hammurabi. We know that to be true. So if you're saying that Christianity is a source of morality, and Christianity got its morality from other cultures and laws that came before it, then obviously Christianity isn't the source of morality. Because the morality that Christianity gets comes from something else, comes from somewhere else, comes from different peoples and different cultures. So it doesn't make sense to say that Christianity is the source of morality when we know that the moral laws in the Bible come from laws that came before the Bible from different civilizations. It doesn't make any sense. But that's the dogma that comes to Christianity. You have to say that God is the source of morality because then outside of that, there'll be no reason to be a Christian. The whole point of Christianity is first to assume that everybody wants to live in a world where morality is the standard, where people don't steal from each other, people don't kill each other, people don't lie to each other. So you're first assuming that that's the world that there is a utopian standard that everybody wants to live by, which is obviously incorrect. That is obviously not true because people who have power and people who have money and people who have the means to live however they want to don't want to live in that kind of world. They don't want to live in a world that's equal. They want to live in a world that's unequal. They don't want to live in a world of justice. They want to live in a world of injustice because it benefits them. So that's the first assumption that Christians have to make. And then the second assumption that Christians have to make is that if you want this utopian world that is dependent on morality, the only way you can have that world is by being a Christian, which is also incorrect because all you have to do is find one person who is moral and is not a Christian, and that debunks your whole argument. So that's why street preachers will go out will go the extra mile and say it might seem like somebody is moral, but if they're a Christian, they're really not. And that's the point of saying that unbelief in itself is a sin. Because if unbelief wasn't a sin, then you could live morally as the Bible prescribes. You could not kill, you could not steal, you could not lie. But as long as you're not a Christian, you would still be sinning. That's the whole point. The whole point is to make it absolutely mandatory to believe in God in order to be moral. Even if you do everything right, even if you live in a way that's moral, if you're not a believer, you'll still be seen as immoral, which doesn't make sense because if I live the same way, if I live as an ideal Christian and you don't know me, you'll probably assume that I am a Christian until I tell you that I'm not, because you can't look at somebody and say, "Ooh, well, I can tell that person's a Christian by the way they live," which is something that street preachers talk a lot about. I know you by your fruit. But the fact of the matter is, you're only saying that based on the first impression that you got from the person that you spoke to. If you never spoke to them, you wouldn't come to that conclusion. You see somebody drinking, you come to the conclusion that they're not a Christian because true Christians don't drink. You see somebody smoking, you assume that they're not a Christian because true Christians don't smoke. But if you see somebody just walking by in the street giving money to a homeless person, are you going to automatically assume that that person's a Christian? Probably not. And even if you do, you wouldn't be justified in doing so because you don't know the person. And that's a problem when it comes to their righteous judgment that they talk about. If you do enough research, you'll find out that these street preachers, this righteous judgment that they always say that they're exhibiting, they really don't. You know, they always talk about, I can judge you because the Bible says to judge righteous judgment. But then when they get caught judging unrighteously, they'll automatically make an excuse for why they made an unrighteous judgment. So they are righteous because they make righteous judgments, but then when they get caught making an unrighteous judgment, they're so righteous, they just made a mistake. Everybody else though is an unrighteous sinner who needs to repent, but they are just a righteous sinner who got a righteous I'm sorry, righteous saint who got caught making a mistake. So they're still righteous even if they make an unrighteous decision, as long as it's not willful in their minds. And in their minds, they can't do any sin that is willful because they believe that their intentions are pure. And because their intentions are pure, any sins that they commit are automatically deemed um, unwillful sin. So basically, they can make as many quote unquote mistakes as they want, but they can never be a sinner. In their minds, that's how they see it. And it's the bias that they have where as quote unquote true Christians, they can do no wrong. Literally, they can do no wrong in their minds. But everybody else, all of the others in their minds, everything that they do is wrong. You're only seen as, um, what's the word that they use? You're only seen as humble if you're willing to listen and to actually consider what street preachers are talking about. But when street preachers disregard everybody else, that it's not seen as them being proud. So in order to be humble, you have to listen to what a street preacher has to say, but a street preacher doesn't have to listen to anybody else. Why? Because they're righteous and they have the right way, and everybody else is wrong. So everybody else has to be humble by listening to a street preacher, but a street preacher is already humble, so they don't have to listen to anybody. That's the viewpoint that they have, which is absolutely incorrect. And so that bleeds into their whole dogma about morality, which is, when you look at it logically, incorrect. And these are usually the parts where a street preacher will say, well, default to faith. So they'll say that their viewpoint is absolutely logical until you dismantle their viewpoint logically, and then they'll backtrack to, well, that's why you need faith. But the thing is, if you really believe that and you really think that faith is that pivotal, then you wouldn't rely on logic at all. You'd rely on faith for everything. But if you look at the life of a street preacher, any Christian in general, they don't live that way. Everybody lives in a way that's logical. If you're walking and you see a puddle of water, you're going to walk around that puddle because you don't want to get wet. It's a logical thing to do. You step in the water, your clothes are going to get wet. If you don't want your clothes to get wet, you'll avoid the puddle. It's a logical way to do things. And that's how everybody lives their life. But when it comes to Christianity, all of a sudden, logic goes out the window. Apologetics attempts to excuse the Bible or justify the Bible by logical means. But then when it's dismantled by that same logical means, then it defaults to faith. So the whole Christian stance or viewpoint is faulty. It's faulty at its core. And the thing about street preachers is that it doesn't matter how logical you are or how you try to point out the faults in their reasoning or the faults in their logic or the faults in how they live. As if they don't deem you to be a true Christian, they're not going to listen to you, even if you're the right one. And that goes into everything that they believe in, especially their faulty look on morality. A morality that they say is decreasing only because Christianity is decreasing. But as I mentioned previously, if you go back to the inception of America, where everybody was Christian, you see things that they will consider to be immoral, such as genocide and slavery. So then how do you excuse that? How do you say that we need to go back to a time where everybody was Christian, which will lead to an abundance of morality, when you go back and you look at the history and you'll see that immorality abounded even when everybody was Christian? I mean, even if you don't want to, well, even if you're ignorant of history, which the street preachers are, all you have to do is look at a majority Christian nation today outside of America and see, is there any immorality present? And the answer is yes. It doesn't matter if it's 90, a nation that's 95% Christian, a nation that is 99, even 100% Christian, you're still going to see immorality. Why? Because immorality is just part of human nature, and you're going to see it everywhere. It's not going to go away, even if everybody was a quote unquote true Christian, as the street preachers believe is a source of getting rid of all immorality. That's not going to fix things. It's not possible to achieve this quote unquote utopia that these street preachers talk about, and they know that, which is why they hedge up all of their bets on heaven, which is supposed to be this place where everything is perfect and nothing goes wrong. There is no evil, which again doesn't make sense, because if evil exists because free will and there's free will in heaven, then there's no way that you can have free will in heaven with no evil. That just doesn't make sense. And the argument is usually free will is the cause of evil. If you have free will, there will necessarily be evil. Which means the only way for there not to be evil in heaven is if there's no free will. But there will always be free will in heaven, because even if Christians were to admit that angels and everybody else who ends up in heaven don't have free will, God still has free will. So unless you're saying that God has some kind of special free will which doesn't allow evil, and then that brings up a whole host of other questions, such as if God has this special free will that doesn't allow evil, then that means it's possible to have free will and not commit evil, which then brings up the question as why didn't God give us that free will that clearly exists if he really doesn't want evil? It just, all the way down, it doesn't make sense. Logically, by any means, it doesn't make any sense. Which basically brings me to the conclusion that it's basically all dogma. Being a Christian is basically just about believing things that are foundational to the faith that don't have to make sense and don't make any sense. But the Christians have to find a way for it to make sense in their minds in order to deal with the cognitive dissonance that they have. But anyway, I ended up talking a bit too long. Probably 10 minutes too long. But I hope you enjoy my talk, and I'll see you in the next one.